Okay, good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our practitioners panel in just a second. One of the things I wanted to highlight is that right after this panel, we're going to go into the reception where poster presenters are going to be next to their posters. So if you are a poster presenter, when we finish this and your poster's not set up yet, that'll be a good time to do that. Cool. So this panel, this practitioners panel, is something that we introduced to Code, I think, about 3 years ago. So one of the things we're really proud of about this conference overall is a lot of mix between people from academia and industry and, well, NGOs and government as well. And so that's a real feature of the conference. But we wanted to have a moment to really talk about some of the things that don't necessarily turn into a technical paper or talk or something like that, but are the broader issues that we face in using experimentation in organizations. And so I think it's been a very popular part of the conference since then, and I'm really excited about our panel this time and our panelists. And so I'm just going to go ahead and briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll hear a lot more about sort of what they're working on as it comes out through some of the questions. So Widad Machmouchi is Principal Data Science Manager at Microsoft. James McQueen is a Principal Applied Scientist at Amazon. Tushar Shanker is Director of Data at Grow Therapy. And Wenjing Zheng is Tech Lead for Ecosystem Data Science at Roblox. And so I think there's a lot of different things we can dig into. But I'm going to go ahead and get started with something that maybe is at the core of experimentation, which is metrics. What's the outcome? So how do we go about choosing what makes a good metric? And I think, Widad, you had some thoughts about that maybe will help kick us off.
Sure. I think a good metric is a metric that points you in the right directions most of the time and is simple to understand. So typically when you run your experiments, you have like multiple moving parts. You have your instrumentation, your data, your logging, you have your users and how they're assigned. So really you want to be able to look at the metric, and when you see the movement, understand why the metric is moving a certain way. So kind of focusing on simple metrics, even if you're talking about OEC, even if you're talking about metrics that are trying to encode your business decision, having these simple metrics, these metrics be simple, debuggable, and understandable is very important. You need to trust their movement. So that's kind of an important aspect when you're thinking about which metrics to look at or which metrics to use in your decision. And also metrics need to be pointing in the right direction and the North Star of your business. So do you know what, if the metric move, what does it mean? Is it good for the user? Is it bad for the user? Is it good for the product? Are you able to go and understand what made it move a certain way? Because there's nothing, I think, more frustrating than seeing a metric move in an experiment and you have no idea how to proceed. Whether is it I don't know, a certain errors went up and you don't know how to go and debug it, or some user satisfaction metric went down and you don't necessarily understand why, where is it coming from. So I think thinking about metrics that are simple and metrics that you can interpret and point you in the right directions, I think are kind of three main properties.
Yeah, does anyone else want to chime in on that? Yeah.
I'd just like to add that I echo everything Widad just said. One thing to keep in mind is just you want it to drive business outcomes, right? So you want it to be specific, the SMART framework, specific, measurable, actionable, interpretable, the R&D. But ultimately what we are trying to drive at is, can your metric movement actually lead to a business decision? Right? Are you able to make it actionable in some way? Is a movement up or down going to lead to some change in your business decision? That's probably one of the biggest points for me.
And I mean, one thing that I think about just in talking about metrics and outcomes is that in some sense, that's not really immediately part of the purview of an experimentation team, right? In some ways, this can be a bigger picture thing that we're tracking in time series. In some ways, the actual measurement of the metric may require instrumentation that's happening through code or through survey data. And so what's necessary in terms of an experimentation team actually working with defining metrics? Should the experimentation team also own all those metrics, or how do you organize that? Yeah, Wenjing?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit about how it's organized in Roblox. There is a few core company metrics that is owned by the experimentation team. And then there are also vertical specific metrics that one vertical develops but other vertical uses. So in that case, those verticals onboard the metrics onto the experimentation platform, but they own the pipeline. So here you have a more democratized system of being able to accommodate lots of metrics from different verticals. But the downside of that is who should be responsible and accountable when something breaks. Usually, right, how do you make sure that there's trust in the overall system, not just the core company metrics, and more proactively communicate when things fail?
Yeah, to some degree, sometimes as an experimentation team, you're like slapping your seal of approval on some results involving a metric, but where did that metric come from? There also can be a lot of issues in that case of standardization. Maybe people end up loading in very similar versions of metrics. And so I wonder if any of you have thoughts about how you can kind of push towards not having 5 versions of time spent.
Yeah, it's a really hard problem. And like as you might expect, Amazon has hundreds of different possible things and a bunch of thousands of teams that all do very specialized stuff. So like we can't possibly own all of the metrics and all of the onboarding. We do have a bunch of checks and balances to try to make sure that when they go to add a new metric, they're like, well, have you checked to see if it's one of the existing ones? Or, there's no need to add sales in books when we have sales, and then you can just look at books category, right? So like, but it's not a perfect system, and it's kind of the trade-off between scale and white glove. Like in an ideal world, they would go to a statistician and we would talk about how to measure things. And you do that, but like there just aren't enough statisticians in the world to add all of the metrics that the people at Amazon want to add. So like that never scales, which means you kind of have a trade-off of like, yes, a team could go add dollars per dollar spent, which would be completely meaningless, but they are unable to do that. So like, how do you try to educate them, give them the tools to know what a good metric is? And so like, all the things that Widad was talking about. And on our side, we can do like data quality checking and turn things off if there's, outliers that are unexpected, and try to do some amount of that to make sure that there's transparency and guide them. But at the end of the day, like it's not scalable for us to say, we will even put a stamp of approval, really on every single metric, depending on how much of a stamp that is. Like it could be a really cursory glance, but like if you really want to do a deep dive, and the other challenge is like the business, they know their metrics way better than I'm ever going to be able to understand their business. And so like there is, how much value is there in, me arguing back and forth about whether they should measure their business that way or not. So it's a big trade-off.
One thing I'll add here is that one thing that experimentation platforms can do is, so we have access to pretty much every experiment and every metric value produced for that experiment. One of the things we have done is what we're calling kind of metric health checks, which actually you can go and check for outliers. You can go and check how often does your metric move. Does it align with how much you'd expect it to move? Is one of the very basic, simple ones is your metric actually constant in every experiment you compute? Which surprisingly happens a lot because metrics get stale, data gets stale. So even as a platform, because you have access to all of that, you can do a lot of meta-analysis that could help. So Tushar mentioned Smart. We have this framework we call Steady, which covers these various properties of a metric, and you can actually have checks that cover those aspects because you have access to an experiment corpus that you can test your metrics on.
Are there any? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, just on the discoverability question that you mentioned earlier, as you have a horizontal platform and more verticals using it, one of the less sexy but super important things to do is metadata tagging, both for tests and for metrics as well that teams run on. It's not the fun thing to do, but it's so important a posterior for any kind of meta-analysis.
Sorry, just one thing to add here to level set is that I agree with everything that has been said on the stage, but that I also want to say that applies to a larger company, right? Once you have reached the size and scale and have a pretty established data engineering team, yes, that makes perfect sense. And that was my reality till I was at Uber for 5.5 years. But more recently, I've joined an early stage startup, and it's completely all over the place, right? There is a lot of tech debt that has already been taken on. Different teams, different business teams who really know their business define something as simple as retention differently. And we are having to go and really standardize that, clean that up. One of the things I was talking to one of the sponsors here, Eppo, the CEO, Che, and I actually work together at Airbnb is, do we have a semantics layer, something that can standardize how metrics are defined and be consumed in the same way across the company, right? That's something that's taken for granted at a bigger company, but we are still, taking baby steps towards that. So, yes.
Well, so I think it's great that we're agreeing on a lot of things, but it can be good to maybe, have a little bit more disagreement. So are there any types of metrics that any of you particularly hate or at least dislike, right? That people are always asking for, but it's not going to deliver what they think it's going to deliver?
Ratios can be a really dangerous one. If you don't quite understand what you're doing with the ratios, it can be really easy. Like they're very intuitive, returns per order and things like that. But if you don't realize whether you're moving the numerator or moving the denominator, your ratio can go up, but the economic value can go down. And so that can be really nuanced. Like obviously it's really important to look at returns per order as opposed to gross returns, but you can't look at it in a vacuum. So that's one that comes up a lot.
Yeah, see, that's exactly what I was thinking of, so I'm not sure that this helped create some disagreement.
I think for me, as much as I love metrics, there are definitely metrics I absolutely hate. One of them is NPS, so Net Promoter Score. And typically when you're dealing with when you ask user for explicit feedback, people think, I have the explicit feedback of the user. I should track this in an experiment. And just always, low power, very few users answer these kind of surveys. It has a lot of selection bias. I think I would say NPS would be the metric that I don't want to see on an A/B experiment scorecard.
Right, and I think both of these are things that somehow, ideally, we think that we do actually want to measure, but it's just, there are serious pitfalls a lot of the time.
One metric that, sorry, were you?
No, you can go ahead.
One metric that gets asked a lot, especially in a business context, and I worked in the marketing organization at Uber, and down funnel metrics, like way further down the funnel, that's asked a lot, right? Our driver funnel, it takes 12 weeks for a driver who clicked on an ad to finally start driving. We can't have experiments that last 12 weeks and then one additional month to measure that. So we had to hack our way around that by developing predictive models that predict the down funnel metrics. But yeah, that down funnel metrics give me a lot of headache.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think actually sort of trying to predict later parts of this funnel or later periods in time is like a topic that seems to be really popular this year at Code, thinking about long-term effects and surrogacy. And so what's actually kind of useful there for you right now? What are you doing to address those problems?
Yeah, so for us, obviously, as what Tushar said, the business is interested in the long-term metrics, but as the data scientist, you can only get to those short-term metrics. Right now, one of the core things I'm working on is the proxy metrics. As we saw today in many talks, proxy metrics is super important. But aside from like the data science technical challenges of what are the good way of deriving proxy metrics, there's also the organizational challenge of how do you convince stakeholders to longer experiments so that you can actually have the data to validate that your proxy metric method is good. So it's really technical. One of those things where technical advances itself won't solve it. We do need that organizational mindset change.
Mm-hmm. On some of that, using these kind of proxy metrics, especially ones that are maybe combinations of many proxies, it seems like that can push a little bit against this idea of we should have simple and interpretable metrics.
Yes.
Yeah, totally. But it's super tempting. Like these lifetime value style metrics are, really common, and people are very interested in doing them. And as a business, it sort of makes a lot. It's like, oh yeah, if I could just told you the long-term value, clearly that's the thing that we should measure. But what you see is like when, in an academic paper, when you do it, there's a lot of scrutiny that goes into all of the surrogates, and then there's a lot of postmortem that goes into the analysis to sort of know whether you really trust that. But then you try to do it at scale, and a lot of that kind of goes away. And then, as the metrics get more and more or less and less transparent, so you have a team that's like, well, do I just accept the black box that it gives me a big number and I just go with it? Do I push back and try to engage with it? And that can be a challenge.
Yeah, I think I've gone through this path of starting with very simple metrics, and then when we're developing OECs, and then get to a place where it's still linear model from my understanding, simple, but it's just like eventually you're asking, product owners to make a decision based on it, right? It's very easy when it's green, when it's positive, then yes, this is, of course I should ship, it's positive. When it's red or it's negative, it's like, no, this is a black box, I don't know what's moving, right? So you really want to be avoiding getting into those situations as much as you can. So that's why I feel like, even when thinking about proxy metrics, making sure if you have a less transparent metric, to have kind of a data scientist accompanying that metric for every analysis, simply because, well, not every analysis, but like for some analysis, because you need to provide that guidance sometimes to where you want a good metric, a very metric that is really capturing the effect that you want, but you also don't want people to fall into like incorrect interpretations of it.
Yeah, and really motivated reasoning with some things it can be hard to escape the conclusion. Other things maybe you can try to rationalize your way out of it.
I am curious to hear the thoughts of the folks here around long-term holdouts. We had really good long-term holdout hygiene at Uber, especially on the marketing side, because you run a bunch of experiments, but to actually understand long-term impacts, we kind of held out a group of people. I'm curious to see if that is something that you price practice as well.
So at Roblox, we have, depending on the team, we have 1 year to 6 months long-term holdouts. But obviously, there's the complexity that comes with actually implementing it and what it means for each feature rolled out. In my previous company at Netflix, we didn't have that. So I think there's really a variability of practice.
Yeah, we have long-term holdouts at Amazon, and they get used for validation of those types of metrics. Are also super important for that. I think the interesting thing with long-term holdouts is there's like a selection bias to, like, you would only long-term holdout usually the things that you have some concern. And so when you go to validate those long-term models, well, the thing that you're validating on are the long-running problems that you selected that are sort of distributionally potentially slightly different from the global set of experiments that you might be interested in. So we use them, they're super valuable, but in my mind, I'm always thinking like, well, we validated it on a biased set of experiments that usually exhibit some weird trade-offs or some expectation of long-term value. And does that validity there actually hold over when I say, well, therefore, whatever I'm doing is valid for the whole set of experiments?
Yeah, and just maybe to unpack that a little bit for some of the audience, at least here's a typology of long-term holdouts kind of I've seen. One is like where it's really held out of sort of all actions of some type. So maybe all paid marketing actions, for example. Another would be held out of some particular kind of product launch or new feature launch, and it's a really specific thing and maybe driven by particular worries we have about the long term versus the short term. The other one is something more like a back test, where you might say we're evaluating all of the improvements in this ranking model since the start of the year, and so the holdout condition is whatever you had at the start of the year. And obviously, I mean, that one I think especially can create a bunch of engineering challenges, which is maybe what you were referring to. Does that match the kind of the typology you all have of that?
Yeah, I think for me, like that last point you have around, the engineering cost of it, I think is something that people underestimate, or at least, so in our platform, the product teams come and say, oh, we want support for holdouts. And my first question would be for them, well, are you able first to reverse an experiment? Reverse a feature that you have shipped? Because if you don't have the ability to just say, I want to reverse, I shipped something and I'm going to reverse it. If your stack is so complex that you can't do that, maintaining the holdout is going to be a very significant engineering investment that you have to do. Yeah. And this becomes particularly important with AI models as well. When you also have data streams that you're updating and regularly updating, how are you thinking about maintaining a population without those, without a new model, without updated data as well? So I think the engineering cost of it, I think, grows a lot. So that's why I think it's important to understand what is the team looking for from the holdout, and first try to kind of answer it with less engineering costly solutions.
And also, even in addition to the engineering challenges, is even if it's a long-term holdout, it's not going to perfectly capture the thing that you want to measure, because you're going to have migrations and improvements on the new system, bug fixes that the old system may or may not get. Sometimes it's just not compatible. So then the control will get worse and worse. It's not really a realistic measurement of that total incrementality of this team's output.
But often that's good for the PM's bonus.
It becomes
Right?
an engineering risk.
Right, because some of the the idea that maybe that holdout or back test is kind of slowly degenerating
Yep.
is actually a great way to make our total gains over the half look a lot better. So there's always these incentive issues
There is.
lurking
It's a big part,
everywhere,
yeah.
right? Though that actually might be an interesting thing for you to say something about, Tushar, is like how some of the organizational and incentive and collaborative aspects of things have changed from being in a bigger firm versus a smaller one, right? I mean, I think it can be really quite different.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point, right? Ideally, your bigger company is a well-oiled ship, right? It's a well-oiled machine. And you are operating in your own swim lanes. For example, the marketing team, for example, has their own marketing holdouts and is refreshing them on a half-yearly basis. And the PMs within the ad tech group are aligned on those incentives. Things get a lot more muddy when you're a much smaller company. Like, for example, right now, marketing kind of sits between product and marketing. So when you're running a growth experiment, you kind of have to see who's the PM owner, and then also factor in what metrics each of those care about. Some of those metrics might actually be at odds with each other. Some of those might align well, and that's where your role as a data scientist kind of changes from just being the statistical teacher in some ways to actually helping drive business alignment in some ways. You are helping define metrics that align with the business purpose, and that involves in a lot of instances, to your previous question, Dean, working closely with engineering to actually instrument some of those metrics, putting instrumentation frameworks in place, doing instrumentation audits, because ultimately you really care about something where you want to know, is that what you're actually measuring? So.
Though that maybe can also be a case where in that smaller organization, you perhaps end up with more aligned incentives between these different players, as opposed to sometimes the experimentation data scientists are playing sort of data police of some kind.
Yeah, at least that's the case here. I'm trying to drive towards that. Again, it's definitely an uphill climb, but we'll get there.
Cool. So one thing, and we'll take some questions from the audience in just a minute, so be thinking about that. But one thing I wanted to touch on that you brought up, James, was the idea of trying to use really more granular, detailed data in constructing metrics or in just doing other sorts of analyses. I think very often we think about, okay, we've got one Y per user, or maybe we have a few different metrics, but we're just looking at one, or we're looking at it on a daily roll-up basis. But in so many of these settings, there's just so much more detailed information available. Yeah, what are you thinking about in that regard?
It relates a lot to Martin's talk right at the beginning. I think a lot of it is because the foundation of A/B testing is in the agriculture where you waited a year and then you got your crop yield, right? And so we have these things, we know about t-tests and covariate adjustment and all that stuff. And so we just say, well, I have 100 values for this customer. I'm just going to add them all up, and then I'll just shove it into this machinery that I know. Right? I have a hammer. I'm looking for nails. But in reality, at least on Amazon and presumably in almost all of the platforms, I don't just have the total amount of money that a customer spent in an experiment. I have every single purchase. I also know, they bought coffee every single Monday, so I shouldn't be shocked when they buy coffee on Monday and attribute that to treatment, right? And so that there's opportunities to help denoise by sort of understanding that there's regular cadences to the way that customers behave. And if you just summarize them in a single value, you miss all of that. Customers pretty consistently visit Amazon at a 24-hour cycle. If you line it up, customers come back roughly the same time every day. And so I should be able to take advantage of those patterns, right? Even in a single experiment. But then once I have a time series model using time series covariates and time series outcomes, I ask the question of, well, can I forecast this forward in time? And now that's a very different approach to a standard surrogates approach, where you might take I'm going to build an observational model based on pre-experiment data, and then I'm going to measure the surrogate impacts and use that forward. But again, that's going back to the assumption that actually I have one outcome for each person. But in reality, I have a time series of outcomes, and knowing how that evolves over time both gives me the ability to control for these patterns, but also to consider forecasting them. So that's one area that I'm particularly interested in.
Yeah, and I guess I would also think about that as a path to potentially creating other proxy metrics. I mean, some that are kind of actually already widely used in some industry areas have that sort of character, like some sort of time conversion metrics that are used in digital advertising, where you're sort of only looking at events that happen in some potentially very small time window, et cetera. Yeah. You're nodding your head.
I'm trying to think about how we actually use that in our platform. One aspect of our platform that I think makes it a little bit different than I think many of even the big companies here. So at Microsoft, we are one experimentation platform that's dealing with 20 different products. So you're dealing with Office, you're dealing with Bing, which are completely different verticals and have completely different experimentation needs. So a lot of what we start thinking about, what can you do with a specific metric, or how can you do take a specific technique and kind of help advance experimentation in one area versus the next, they just end up being they're unique for a specific product. And then if you're thinking about it from platform perspective, how do you platformize it? So it ends up we end up even though we have a lot of that data, we end up facing a lot of challenge. And how can you platformize it in a way that experimenters from product 1 can use it, but also experimenters from product 2 can use it? And at least for us, that ends up limiting the ability of kind of any kind of advanced analysis like that we can do. But I think we've talked about this at Cider as well.
We intentionally, with the way that we onboard metrics, we try to onboard them at as granular level as possible. So even if it's down to the per impression, and then they can tag those with what we call dimensions. But so for example, just to take the sales example, because it's really obvious, right? Customer bought coffee, it was $9.99. They bought it from this particular vendor at this particular time, and they have all these features. And now, to your point, some businesses might have very little information, and they kind of do all these aggregations. So the limitation of well, maybe it's super valuable in an ad space where I have really high granularity data, but maybe from some other metric it's not as valuable. I think that's definitely a transfer problem. But the way that we think about it is I have some metric, but instead of it being YI, I have YIT, and I might have features, CIT about those. To be quite honest, this is still research. We don't have a solution there. But it's something I'd like to see generally, the academic audience as well, thinking about, in the digital world of experimentation where we just have such high frequency levels of data, how can we really take advantage of that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting direction. So one thing I wanted to touch on, which maybe related to this sort of platformizing of things, is the process of trying to spread the practice of experimentation, either in a new startup to build it in from the ground floor, or into new product areas. And some of that can be about picking what are sort of the good first experiments to run in some areas. How do you kind of, have a good first impression for experimentation?
I can start, but I would like to address take a step back and address a bigger question, where does experimentation actually fit in a company, right? Ideally, you kind of think about analyses, experiments, or any sort of quasi-experimental methods. It's helping the company learn and grow. You're learning something about your business. It could be about your customers, about the supply side of your platform. It's helping you make decisions and grow. In that context, yes, you ideally want a learning agenda that is agreed upon at the beginning of a quarter or a half. And if you're introducing experimentation for the first time, we've all learned at grad school, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard of causal inference, right? But in a business context, you kind of want to build confidence, especially with the leaders in the company, that, hey, this is worth the investment. This is, you simply by doing pre-post, you will get some measure of impact, but doing an A/B test, even though it might cost, you might have to pay a platform to get that, and you'll have to invest resources in defining metrics, it is going to get you a more precise causal answer. So to that extent, I would recommend going with the simplest possible experiment, a simple product feature that is going to be way better than not having that feature. Start off with that, right? Show that the users are actually deriving value, and you can clearly identify this is the amount of value the users are deriving, compare it with the cost, and show this is a positive ROI experiment. Start there.
I think that's interesting as well, because one of the challenges is sometimes the big gains from experimentation are finding the things that don't work, but that can be a challenging way to start.
I think safety as a gateway drug is a really valuable one. It's like instead of going to them like, oh, I can tell you how much your business is worth. What I can do is like I can help you launch your product, and then if something goes wrong, I will tell you really quickly, and you can turn it off. And so I find that like it's the safety. You get the engineering team on board. They're like, oh, okay, this gives me a toggle ability. I can turn it on. I can see what happens, and then if stuff starts failing, I can quickly turn it off again. And so actually, I find that, at least at Amazon, like that safety is the gateway drug to experimentation.
This is actually very true also for us as well. Like, yes, you start with the simple experiment when you're trying to kind of get people to understand what it's about. But then you get the leadership buy-in when they're just rolling a bug fix. And you tell them, actually, if you just rolled it, you would have caused the life site because there's a problem with it. Or so just like those unexpected regressions that you wouldn't have caught or you wouldn't have been able to stop unless you rolled this out as an A/B experiment, measured it, and be able to stop it. So these tend to get the leadership in to say, yes, actually, this is valuable and we need to have it.
Cool, and I think some of that could really depend on the phase and the organization, because are people feeling conservative? Are they feeling like they don't want to slow down, et cetera? It can be really different. So I think let's start taking some questions from all of you. I think we have a couple mics floating around. So yeah, maybe there's a question right up here, or maybe we don't have the mics floating around yet. Okay. We'll come back to that in a second. So I think just picking up on the kind of some of the practice of experimentation there. How much of that is tools? How much of that is culture? How much of that is training?
I think at the beginning of scaling up experimentation, tools is really important. Told to me by oral historians at Roblox, just 1 or 2 years ago, they were running single-digit number of experiments, but once they really scale up that platform of building out the data pipeline, reliable data pipeline, at least for the company guardrail metrics, implementing like streamlined allocation and analysis tools, making it very easy to set up experiments for at least the core types of randomization units, then in the span of 1 or 2 years, you're now at hundreds of experiments a year. So really that 0 to 1 is about unblocking the human cost, the labor cost of running experiments, how cheap it is to run, and reliable, of course.
Yeah, so a lot of that is about, do people even have the ability to do this easily, right? Yeah. And I guess this was in a setting, at least, where there was some latent motivation. Yeah. In other settings, maybe the latent motivation isn't there. Yeah,
I mean, in parallel, you do need to have that more, like the culture of just curiosity, humility, and being data informed.
I completely agree. We are actually there on the grow side of the house, which we have an experimentation platform, but all the logging is just completely all over the place, right? So there's a lot of investment that needs to go into actually making that platform work for us, right? And we ideally want to get to a point where data scientists are not in the loop in making experiments, but I think we'll probably get there in like 6 months' time.
Cool. Okay. I think maybe we've got somebody with a mic here. Great.
Hi. So I had a follow-up question with regards to experimentation culture. So you mentioned about getting kind of the buy-in from the leadership kind of to get started, but also like the people who are going to run the experiments are the actual product teams. So kind of the question is in terms of where it's best to put the effort in terms of focusing on educating the product teams, so actually educating leadership. So do you have some ideas?
You have to do both, I think, at the end of the day. And honestly, I find that oftentimes the same reasons that you would convince leadership, like safety, right? Like if I'm an engineer and I'm going to get paged if this breaks, and I'm very cheekily dialing up on Friday, then I don't want to get paged on the weekend. And so if I have a tool that tells me that it'll and it might even automatically roll back and I feel much more comfortable doing that, then again you can kind of get buy-in from both directions. And you have to do education again from both directions, and hopefully at a large scale you kind of have to cause that to be self-reinforcing. And so I think we mentioned it in the 2019 paper, but Lab and a bunch of other companies have Like we call them web lab bar raisers or Wilburs, which I think is hilarious. And those squads get built up in their own organizations, and they become the self-reinforcing. So like Search has a big squad, and they spend a lot of time educating the other new people and other leadership in their own organization, and that becomes kind of a self-reinforcing mechanism so that we as a central platform don't have to go around constantly and do that type of thing.
One thing I'll add, so it depends a little bit on the organization that you're dealing with. At Microsoft, typically products are very KR or OKR driven. So one way to actually say experimentation can help with product owners is that you can actually prove that you improved a certain metric by a certain amount. So many of the KRs that got taken, I wanna increase I don't know, a specific metric by X%. And running these experiments will actually say, instead of just tracking a metric over time, trying to see the impact, when you run the experiment, you can be very confident that you actually, contributed to the improvement in that metric. So it's kind of, if there's a KR setting culture in the org, experimentation goes hand in hand with that.
And I think one more aspect of that is have the culture of data scientists being bringing early in the product ideation stage, where you work with the product team to say, here is the architecture of all the features, the angle you want to build, how we're going to sequence out the type of experiments that we will, so that we know what should be built on top of these. Just be early on that roadmap planning.
Yeah, I think one thing I've seen is sometimes people build a whole big feature and then run an experiment with it, and then the experiment comes back negative, and then the experiment becomes this sort of frustrating gating experience for everything. Whereas if people had really, parameterized much more of that whole product feature and experimented along the way, they could have had a very different, more positive experience with experimentation. Okay, I think we've got another question over here.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask about a little bit after you've got your experimentation platform built. You've got everybody on board. They want to run experiments. You actually have a lot of experiments to run, and they're not going to work well together. Some of them are going to conflict. Some of them are going to interact and cause horrible causation problems, destroy your results. So how do you manage that conflicting desire to have experiments from all these different groups as a unit so that everybody gets to run experiments? They don't conflict, you run the right ones together. So that's, I think, a very complicated problem.
Cool, I think this is a good question because it may create some controversy here. So, yeah.
I'll get started. I say the one thing that you don't necessarily have to worry about as much in A/B experimentation is flight interaction. And I'll do a shameless plug here for EXP's blog. We actually have a blog post exactly about this, and it says, just relax about it. Flight interaction itself is not as big as people imagine it to be, to where it's in any way should stop you from experimenting. I think people think it's more than it actually is. So I'll stop at the flight interactions. I know there are other questions there.
I actually completely agree. I have a lot of that's a boogeyman that I talk about a lot, and I also hate the you just have everything in swim lanes. And that's kind of like putting your head in the sand, because if you never get to see that, treatment A and treatment B interact, and you think that they're both good, you'll then launch them and you'll realize that it's garbage. And so I actually think it's much better to let them interact and analyze them as tuples or as pairs than to say, because even if you do them in sequence, you can't actually get the optimum, right? Because it depends on the order in which you run those tests. And so the best thing I should do is to run them in parallel and analyze them in parallel. But what we find in practice is that almost never makes a difference. And when it does make a difference, the teams are usually very aware that these two features are conflicting, and they kind of know what they're doing. So it's a boogeyman that I feel like gets talked about a lot, but I find in practice it doesn't really matter.
I think the most adverse interactions where you just have a completely broken experience, those are the ones that you want to avoid. But after that disaster situation, it's really not that bad. There are ways to coordinate experiments either through more just weekly sync meetings or through a layer architecture. But what we've seen also, very similar experiences, the interactions are not that bad once you after that, avoid those disaster scenarios.
And I think in terms of unlocking a bunch of experimentation, allowing for lots of overlapping experiments by default is usually a key step there, because otherwise everybody's constrained to be in the same space and they get pushed to run a bunch of low-powered experiments.
Totally.
Yeah. at the risk of angering you and not I'm not going to disagree with any of this.
But she's looking for disagreement. Go for it.
when I first started at Uber in 2018, 2019, the marketing team was specifically very concerned about interactions, right? They actually maintained a very strict experimentation calendar, and each audiences would only be given to one team at a time. But one of the first things that I did was, let's have a conversation. Are these experiments actually going to interact with each other? And if not, why don't we can double and triple our experimentation velocity here. So yeah, we finally moved to that framework, but yes, it's not something I think we need to be worried about.
And to argue just a little bit the other side, one area where I see maybe this becoming a bigger issue is with more use of clustered experimentation. Because with large samples, two experiments that are running independently basically end up being actually orthogonal in sample to each other. But with a small number of clusters, things can be a little bit different and a little bit noisier. Is that a compelling thing to watch out for, or are you just not running that many cluster randomized experiments?
I would say the latter, like not as much. And I think when you're running those, you're kind of, I think, putting more care into them, just because they already require a little bit more care. And I think just because of that, there's a bit more attention being brought to what's running together and what the possible interactions are.
Yeah, that's my experience as well.
Cool. I think maybe we've got another question over here.
Hi, I'm from a WeChat experimentation team, and I have a question. So I think it's quite similar. I think it's related to the education and experimental culture. And in our, as a data scientist from the experimentation team, I usually receive questions from algorithm engineer PMs that they want to speed up their experiment, and we have tried everything to maybe, for example, do the variance reduction, to do some do everything to ensure the validity of the continuous monitoring. We still cannot give them kind of their desirable speed of experiments. So I'm just interested in, have your experimentation platform run into those issues, and how did you communicate with the leaders from the product team or the algorithm engineers?
How do you cope with these impatient PMs?
You tell them to have better ideas. If you had a bigger impact, we'd stop your experiments soon. I mean, it goes both ways, right? It's a signal to noise ratio. There's signal and noise there. And I think that's actually, but I joke, but that's a real point, right? If you keep trying really, really small things and we're not stopping your experiment and you see nothing at the end, maybe we should have stopped you and said, stop wasting your time. But I think there's a big incentives question, right? How do you get people to actually try risky things, both positive and negative? But that's actually the best way to speed up experiment velocity, is to go bigger.
And it's also, I guess, a matter of educating the trade-off that comes with there's no free lunch. You can run a 2-day test and expect to get understand impact of 1 month. So just the trade-off, do you care about novelty effects? Do you care about long-term effects? And just be very explicit and clear with the PMs.
Yeah, and
on some sides on some platforms, you just don't have enough sample size, right? Or your effect sizes are just really tiny. In those cases, that's actually a question that I get asked a lot nowadays. And one of the things that I've advocated for is, you don't have to actually wait for stat sig results in especially early on in the life cycle. You don't actually have to. You just want to make sure you're not breaking things and move fast, right? At some stage, we can start implementing a long-term holdout and increase experimentation velocity, but at least at the end of the quarter, say, hey, we launched 5 experiments, the cumulative impact against the holdout was this much. But yeah, it's not something, you basically just want to unblock them from running experiments.
One thing I'll add, everything was said, I think was great, but I think about alternative experiment setups. So can you change your randomization unit? So depending on what the treatment that you have, if you're doing ranking changes, maybe it doesn't need to be at the user level randomization. Maybe you can do impression level. Another type of experiments that we've been running recently is what we're called shadow experiments, to where you're running treatment and controlled responses for the same user. So you get a paired test instead of unpaired test. And this actually also significantly can improve your sensitivity and hence your duration. So kind of being a bit more, what's the experiment you're running and what's the most optimal experiment setup could help in reducing experiment duration as well.
Yeah, and I think, I'm just wondering, Tushar, like how this has been maybe a point of adaptation for you going from, hey, we have very large sample size, it makes sense to tweak things in the margin, to, hey, we just want to make sure we're not shooting ourselves in the foot, or we want to look for big wins. How's that been as just like actually as an experience for you as a data scientist and manager and growth leader?
It's definitely taken some adaptation because the statistician in me dies a little bit every single time I say, hey, don't worry about confidence intervals. But we're also at a stage in our business where we actually need to move fast and make decisions. So as much as I try to evangelize good statistical hygiene, the reality of it is that you will get there as you scale up and as your platform grows. But some of these decisions are not one-way doors. Like they can actually be reversed as well. So it's not as big a deal as you might be making it out to be.
I agree. And like, don't be beholden to p-value less than 0.05. Like, what's the cost of being wrong?
Exactly.
If the cost of being wrong is nothing and it's a two-way door, then does it really matter? Like, do you really need to be more confident? You just need to be more confident that it's better than control.
Which is why a Bayesian A/B test really is
That's
very
why
intuitive.
that.
Cool. Yep, over here.
Hi, I'm Wenjing from Static. Static is a SaaS company for experimentation. And my question is about causal inference models versus experimentation. And maybe some necessary context. I started my career at Amazon as an economist, and all we do is downstream causal inference models. And then at Facebook, people don't do these models. No. People just do A/B testing and hundreds of A/B testing from one org. And I remember there is a paper from Facebook that they use Facebook actual experimental results and test causal inference models. And basically the conclusion is the causal inference models are just as good as random. So now some of our customers ask us, should you build causal inference models? My instinct is no, but interested in your opinions.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about where does observational causal inference fit into this. Wenjing?
Yeah. Do you want to? Okay. Yes, I would like to reframe that a little bit more, because there will always be the business need and questions about treatments that we can A/B test on. Exactly. Right? So as a statistician, we know there's nothing compares to A/B test. But there will always be the business need for some kind of observational analysis. So I think it's not about whether or not we should do it or we should put a golden seal on it. It's more like, how can we provide something better than someone would just look at some descriptive analysis and say, oh, that's a causal effect, right? How can we bridge the gap from completely descriptive statistics and A/B testing? Where can we get something in between that's better than they would have done otherwise? And how can we correctly communicate the robustness and the caveats and sensitivities in a way that's still actionable? Yeah. But obviously, do that one at a time. It's easier than to be able to scale it the way that we scale A/B testing, right? A lot of places have tried scaling observational causal inference, and the education piece of communicating the caveats and the results, that's always tricky.
Yeah, as Susan was talking earlier about, like, truth in advertising, I think observational causal modeling has a similar risk. It's very easy to oversell because it's very difficult, because you can't run an A/B test to check, especially if something you literally cannot randomize on. So there's no ground truth, that you never get to observe what the actual effect is. And so it's very easy to be like, oh, this sweet model that I built, it's awesome, trust me. And even though it's almost certainly better than the, like, who knows what they would have done without this model, but there's like a tension there. And like, yes, this is almost certainly better than some like random thing that you might have thought of anyway, but there's lots of caveats here, right? Like, this isn't perfect, and it's not an RCT, it doesn't have all the same guarantees, and there's a lot of challenge there, I think.
One thing I'll add, kind of given everything that Wenjing and James said, is when you're thinking about it as a product offering, it's going to be extremely hard to have this product offering exist out there in the wild, kind of for folks to use it without having that trigger around it and making sure that you're not making the kind of incorrect decisions based on it. And I think that's a lot of the questions that when you're thinking about from platform perspective, do I have support for it or not? Versus, is that investigations into specific situations where you can't run an A/B test.
Right, so part of it has to do with scaling and how hands-on it can be and how many expert data scientists do you have versus, is this really a question that's that important that you're going to allocate a bunch of human expert time to it?
There's also the fundamental limitation of, like, for example, in the healthcare field, sometimes you just can't randomize on a user level. Ethics come into play. So in those cases, you still want to know what the impact of your treatment is, and causal inference, like one of the initiatives that we recently launched, we did a simple diff and diff, right? We could not actually run an A/B test. So I think both have a very valid role to play in helping businesses make decisions.
Yeah, and I think potentially in the context of a company that's adopting experimentation, you may have a lot of data that's sitting around that answers questions about things you tried before. Should we try them again? And even if now you're in an experimentation mode, there's a lot of risk or a lot of cost of setting things up to try it again. And so that observational data can be at least a good first pass, even if you could experiment with some kind of cost there. Okay, we've got another question over here. Oh, from David.
Yeah, hey, abusing my mic runner privileges. I guess a question that I have for the group is, I guess I've been coming to code for 10 years now. And at the first code, we had very similar conversations about how do you get managers on board with A/B testing, like people don't understand A/B testing. And that made sense to me then, because it had only been a few years since some of the big Ron Kohavi papers came out about the value of A/B testing and so on and so forth. And I'm just struck by how crazy it is that 10 years later, you're all like, yeah, it takes a lot of work to get people on board with A/B testing. Like, they're really skeptical because it's generally the same pool of managers that have been around for many years at all these different companies. And so I guess I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on like what is going on that seemingly the same people need to be reconvinced like every time that experimentation is valuable, because you'd think people would have kind of like internalized this by now.
Or is that even actually true?
Or is that true? Yeah.
Actually, yeah, on that, I don't think it's that we need to tell them to be on board with A/B testing. It's now become, they know they have to do A/B tests. Now it's the more nuanced of what are the things they need to care about: runtime, sample size, efficiency. Like they're more and more tuned into the technical aspect of a test design that we need to educate them around. But in terms of people knowing that A/B testing is important, that ship is, not a sale has arrived, or whatever the expression would be, right? Like even like at Roblox, there are still some product areas that are not fully supported by A/B testing, and they literally ping the experimentation PM every day. When are you going to unblock us? And these are engineers and PMs who want to do that. So yeah, it's different now.
Yeah, as an early stage startup, I don't think there is any question that A/B testing is important, right? But in fact, all our PMs are highly analytical and are looking for high ROI opportunities. The problem though is, and the reality of the situation is, engineering bandwidth is limited. And we need to be mindful of where we can and we cannot run experiments. So that's where the conversation comes in. Hey, is this area worth running A/B tests on right now? Because you will need engineering resources on this to set that. Yes, it might be a one-time cost, but you still need to invest that resources.
And I might say that actually some of the challenges we've discussed are not from a lack of enthusiasm for experimentation, but are sometimes actually like too much savviness on the part of managers, and that often they're using experiments in ways that are not always the best guide to what the truth is, but that match their incentives.
I want to provide an alternative view of this. So what you're talking about really, when adoption of experimentation that's been happening over the past 10 years, if you look at it, it's mostly in consumer-facing products that are most web products. A lot of the thing I face is challenging is enterprise settings with clients, and you like an actual client, not clients and customers. And you have these products have their own safe deployment practices, and they have their own rollout policies. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to integrate experimentation as part of it. And the problems that you face, even from that perspective, are very different than the kind of online consumer space. Because at that point, you really want to be able to make decision quicker so that you can move quicker. You're talking about release cycles that could be in the months. So how can you make sure that with every step of those, you're still enabling data-driven decisions? So I think that I don't think it's about, it's a different, I think, at least from my perspective or my experience currently, it's a different paradigm of experimentation compared to before. It's not about learning. It's not about, oh, I see this metric moving, then it's all good. It's about shipping a safe experience. And I think there's more problems in that space currently than we have solved.
Cool. Well, another question over here.
Yeah, one of the panelists earlier indicated some disapprobation toward NPS. And I hate NPS as much as the next data scientist, but I wonder if you have like a go-to answer for people who do want to measure customer sentiment or customer satisfaction with an A/B test.
I think that panelist.
Sure. I mean, I definitely don't mind having it on an what we call a scorecard for your experiment that you're computing all the time. What I have a problem with is that it becomes the metric that you want to base your ship decision on, right? I think most of the time, more data is good data. In particular with NPS, like I think the like selection bias associated with it, which users kind of report, tend to really bias it. The other actually major problem with it is that you always have very low sample size associated with those. So I don't mind having it in the scorecard, but I think whenever I see it, so usually in our scorecards, like we have categories to help someone navigate it. If I see it in these like top metric categories, I have a problem because it doesn't move typically in an experiment, and then product owners start making decisions based on it. So it's not that the metric itself is I would say is the problem. It's more that how you're presenting it and how you're using it to make a ship decision.
I think overall, a lot of times, a really confusing thing is an underpowered experiment or an underpowered experiment outcome pair. And even pretty sophisticated experimental users get confused by things that are underpowered.
Oh.
One thing I wanted to just kind of pick up on, which is actually, we're going to have a little bit more of this tomorrow, but I know that there's some folks here interested in that as well. Thinking about intensively data-driven products and evolving products like an AI product. What does experimentation look like in that kind of a setting? Some versions of it show up in everything from a simple recommendation system to an AI. But other things are kind of unique to the challenges of experimentation with, say, large language models. I think maybe you might say something about that.
I can get started. I think AI models. I've worked on Bing before. We've been running experiments on those for 2 decades, right? So it's an experiment. It's a product change that you're testing on. But I think with LLMs, one of the things that's coming up a lot right now is that there's this need for fast, like prompt engineering, the new term. Like, how do you test new prompts quickly? How do you detect adverse effects on the user? How do you detect responsible AI issues? And you want to do them in a safe manner and a quick manner so that you're able to roll back quickly. So some of the experiments I was talking about earlier, like these hidden experiments where you test your changes without showing anything to the user first. You run both treatment and control, and you run these experiments in order to, are you having more latency? Are you having more performance issues? Are you possibly facing some responsible AI issues as well? So
and just to unpack that a little bit, that'd be, I submit some sort of query, and you run the query through both algorithms, and then we can have metrics that are defined just on what is being output by the system, as opposed to my response to it.
Yes. And this is a very safe way of just saying, this is kind of a first test for me that I want to do before I release anything to the user. So it's even safer from that perspective. So these are some of the things that I think are coming up within the LLM space, but also managing cost versus the benefit. LLMs are very expensive. So how does the cost reflect with a user value add at the end? So kind of these metrics trade-offs are becoming an important question as well.
Yeah. Plug for the personalization parallel session that was earlier. There's lots of really interesting questions around shared data. Like, if you have testing 2 algorithms to do whatever, but they have some shared common online data, and then, the result of that algorithm, say it's a search algorithm and it causes a customer to click on something or buy something, that feeds back into the data. And so you have these concerns around, interference in that case. I think all the papers in the parallel session, just flip through them. They have some really great ideas around that.
Yeah, and some of that could get even more difficult as it becomes more and more expensive to be training these things in ways that are separate that could exclude, divert data, et cetera. One point I wanted to, do we have another question here? Okay, cool. Yeah.
Great. We started the conversation with about which are your favorite metrics, or what is a good metric, but we also went into, there are many metrics. We cannot just know all the metrics that the company has. I'm wondering if you have a point of view on the number of metrics that an experiment should look of, whether that should be, there should be a limit or should be unlimited, and then deal with the multiplicity of the multiple testing problem.
I think I could give you a number, but it's definitely something that can be difficult. And it can be really tempting for people that want to measure absolutely everything, but there's very few experiments that move everything in the positive direction, and those are really easy. But the more you look at, even if you're controlling for multiple hypothesis testing, the more you sort of have a hard time kind of interpreting and understanding how things work. So I think there is a natural tendency, you should have, some very specific targeted metric or metrics around what you're trying to do. And then you probably have some company-wide, important metrics that guard against cannibalization. And then I think you might want to have that base your launch decision on. You might look at a bunch of other things to sort of help interpret things, but I think it's important to say, these are what we're going to look at to make a decision. And we might have a bunch of other things that we'll look at as supporting evidence or understanding, but I think there's definitely a risk in looking at too much stuff.
Yeah, I think it's about delineating which metrics are for decision and which ones are learning metrics. And learning metrics, you can afford a higher error tolerance, and you maybe don't need to do adjustment. And for the goal and guardrail metrics, you might want to adjust for that.
Yeah, I think interpretability and purposefulness around decision-making play a big role here. For example, what will you do if you see 2 of your primary metrics move in opposite directions? What does that, just being purposeful around that is going to be important. I don't think the number matters as much. Of course, if you have a lot of metrics, you obviously want to correct for that in some way statistically.
So one topic I wanted to get to was just the role of heterogeneous treatment effects, which can actually be related to sort of a multiplicity of metrics. A lot of times people start drilling into effects for subgroups or others. And then in the academic world, there's been a lot of development of techniques for estimating heterogeneous treatment effects with high dimensional covariates, et cetera. What is this sort of all good for? Where have you seen this actually be useful or just confusing for decision makers? I think, James, you had some thoughts on this, I know.
Yeah, it's something I feel pretty strongly about. And I think that the main thing you have to figure out is what do you expect them to do with that information? And I think a lot of the times they're oh, well, I'll just give them a list of people that respond to the treatment, and you can just launch to that subgroup of people. And maybe if it's an email that I'm going to blast to that group, maybe that's really easy to do. But in a lot of cases, that's not actually feasible. And even if it was feasible, well, what about the new customers? Now I got to classify them into the different groups. And so I think it can be useful for understanding. And I think it's particularly useful if you can use that to sort of improve the product. If I know that it's bad for these people and I know who these people are, then I can figure out why it's bad for them, and then I can make it better, I think. But you have to be really intentional about what you want to do. And at least at Amazon, I think the targeting use case is probably smaller than the launching to everybody that I can use case.
We use it a lot on the incentive side of the house, especially on distributing coupons for Uber Eats, for example. We build heterogeneous treatment effect models to identify who to give what sort of coupons to. But yes, outside of that, generally you don't want.
Right, that it really can pop up in these cases where there's some costly treatment or a treatment that at least is going to demand attention from consumers, et cetera.
Yep.
I think that is more on the path of building that personalized uplift model for those treatments. On the other hand, on the more lower dimensional side, you do have cohort analysis in each A/B test. So what are you going to do if you see treatment effects in maybe gender or age groups, right? If you don't know the root cause, like usually gender is just that higher layer, right? It's because maybe some certain latent preferences or something that you don't really actually measure. So what are you going to do about that? Then you have to deal with the complexity of forking your product many times versus rolling it out potentially with some harm.
It can be good for protecting really small groups. I think there was a talk on the early termination stuff that was about what if you have a really small group of people that respond really negatively. This is the same story. Like if I'm looking at sales and I look at new to Prime or new Amazon customers, they just spend less money than people that have been using Amazon like me constantly and have no impulse control. But I don't want to launch products that are really bad for them just because the tyranny of the averages dominates. So it can be really important for that as well.
Cool. I think let's take one last question over here.
I think Jeremy left. You had a question.
Oh, okay. We got one question here then.
Hi, this is Joe. I'm on the experimentation platform team at Chime, so an online fintech company. Basically, I think it's really interesting that we have a spectrum here, right? In terms of in your companies, your experimentation platform are at different stages, right? In terms of maturity. Simple question, one is what's your most loved feature for your platform? Two is what's on your mind in terms of capabilities for your platform. So what's you plan to do next? Thank you.
Most loved feature.
I wouldn't say it's most loved, but I think one of the most useful ones is what we have auto scheduled scorecards. So that you're not relying on the experimenters to go and generate the results themselves after an experiment run. So you already know what you're expecting. It just ends up making ship decision more agile. Just auto scheduling scorecards at specific intervals, I think end up being I think one of the most useful things we have. What am I looking at next? Or what's the platform looking at? I think what I mentioned earlier about how do you think about experimentation in a different space where it's more about safe deployment and what can you do to kind of enable those decisions, I think is an area I think with online experimentation that we haven't thought about as much.
It's a tough question. I don't want to offend any of my colleagues here too. I particularly am a big fan of the Bayesian statistics that we do, and we've kind of over the last few years really migrated towards thinking about posterior probabilities and expected reward and things like that. And that I think shifts the mindset of how people experiment. So I'm really excited to continue to pursue that. And then on the what am I looking forward to? I think some of the work on applying hierarchical models to do heterogeneous treatment effects, and then going really big on covariate and time series models.
My favorite feature in Roblox experimentation platform portal, there is a view where you can look at the meta-analysis of different metric movements per area historically, this year. So that has been helpful, and because it really helps you build that collective business intuition using the past historical data. Things that's top of mind is one of the things is how do you minimize the ad hoc analysis that people have to do off platform, or how, if they must do it, how can you standardize that through libraries and data apps?
It is going to sound silly, but one of the favorite features that I'm looking forward to using is defining custom metrics. Right now, we're just using out-of-the-box metrics. But one thing that's top of mind for me that's a huge initiative internally is event logging, right? Getting our instrumentation right and making sure all of that is audited and functioning well. So that's where I'm focusing my energies.
Cool. Yeah, and I think that really does illustrate some of the range of the maturity, and even from the perspective of you've seen it all be in place, but now having it in some new setting can be a challenge on its own. So we're actually over time, and so we could keep talking about all these topics, but I just want to thank our excellent panelists for this discussion. So I was just going to say really quick what's happening next, which is that we have this reception now. So if you're a poster presenter, please go next to your poster. If you're not a poster presenter, please go next to somebody else's poster and ask them about it. Tomorrow morning, we'll be starting at 9 sharp with Ani Franco and Jorge Guzman. So see you then as well.